The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. It has been more than a decade since Singapore launched its Blue Bin Recycling Initiative. But here's a headline we didn't expect. The National Environment Agency says in 2024, household recycling has hit an all-time low of just 11%. That's down from 12% the year before and the year before that. And the puzzling part? This comes after efforts like recycling box distributions to every household. So what's going wrong? We know Singaporeans care about sustainability. We've seen the rise in food waste recycling, the push toward greener buildings, and even startups turning tofu waste into protein. But when it comes to everyday recycling at home, especially paper and cardboard, we're falling short. So why is that? Well, joining us today is Sonny Rosenthal, who is the Associate Professor of Sustainability Communication at SMU, to discuss more about the latest findings. Hi, Professor. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Hongbin. Thanks for having me.
All right, Professor. Singapore's domestic recycling rate has fallen to a record low of 11% in 2024, the lowest it's ever been, despite efforts like distributing recycling boxes to every household. Was this a surprising finding for you as well?
Not entirely. I've been a bit dismayed, I guess, over the years about how low the domestic recycling rate is. I shouldn't say dismayed, but leaves something to be desired. And the fact that it's dropped a bit lower isn't so much surprising. I think it's just a sign of the way things have been going in recent years.
Okay. But what do you think this says about the effectiveness of public engagement or education so far when it comes to recycling?
NEA has actually done an overall good job with public engagement and education about recycling. And they've been doing this for, I think, almost 25 years now with the National Recycling Program. What I will say is that NEA is in some ways a victim of its own success, because NEA is also responsible for waste disposal in Singapore. And that's done extremely effectively and efficiently to where waste disposal isn't perceived as a problem because it's just dealt with. And so there isn't an urgency to address the waste issue in Singapore, even though I'm sure you've heard that Pulau Semakau is going to run out of space in 2035. At least that's the figure that's been shared by NEA. But even despite that, there doesn't seem to be an urgency. And I think that's part of why individuals don't recycle as much as they could.
Okay. I mean, paper and cardboard recycling saw a sharp drop from 52% in 2018 to just 32% in 2024. Now, this comes even as Singapore generated more paper and cardboard than ever, largely due to online shopping and e-commerce packaging. What do you think is driving this disconnect where more recyclable material is being generated, yet less is actually being recycled?
I think a big part of that has to do with the broader recycling ecosystem. There was I think it's called the National Sword program in China that was launched, I believe, in 2018, which drastically reduced the amount and variety of recyclable materials that Chinese recyclers could accept. And so I think a big part of why recycling has gone down is simply that there's less, if you look upstream of the consumers, there's less of a market for recyclable materials. And so I feel like part of it is simply that there's less demand for those materials. Another part of it, I suppose, is simply just the increase in packaging waste. And if you look over the past decade or so at the waste generation rate in Singapore, it's actually been on a steady decline, except for there was an uptick in 2021. Probably in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, and probably largely driven, and this is per capita waste generation, probably driven largely by increase in e-commerce. So that's another factor that has co-occurred. People just purchasing more stuff online and generating more waste, while at the same time there are fewer options for actually recycling upstream.
Okay, so Professor, do you think this is a case where convenience is outpacing sustainability?
That's definitely part of it, and I think if you look at any of these issues, they're multifaceted. So convenience is certainly a part of it. Actually, as soon as I'm finished with this interview, I'm gonna go pick up something from a locker and something I ordered off an e-commerce site, right? So I participate in this as well because it's extremely convenient, and that's always been a driving factor in consumer decisions. And anytime there's innovation in, for example, in retail, innovation in the case of e-commerce, it has to do with lower cost of manufacturing and increased efficiency of logistics and distribution. Anytime you have those innovations, it becomes more convenient and less expensive for consumers. So yeah, convenience is part of it. Expense is part of it. Perhaps more effective marketing by the e-commerce retailers. There are a lot of factors that have led to an uptick in e-commerce.
Okay. Well, other than e-commerce here, food waste recycling has been more successful, reaching 18% and holding steady thanks in part to regulations that require large food producers to report and treat food waste. How does this compare with how other waste streams are being handled?
I think it's a good example of how government regulations can be deployed effectively to address issues like waste and recycling. Another example in a different waste stream is plastic. There's the plastic bag surcharge that we now pay at large grocery stores, and that's been quite effective. Some grocery stores report up to an 80% reduction in plastic bags that they're distributing. And that's, I'm sure, the high end, but even if it were, say, a 20 or 25% reduction, that would still be substantial. And so I think when regulations are carefully crafted and effectively deployed and the pricing is right, or the penalties are right, or the incentives are right, they can be quite effective.
Okay, so do you think applying the same system to other waste streams like paper or plastic will make a difference then?
So in the case of the food waste, that's a specific type of regulation that requires certain food establishments, large commercial and industrial food, or I should say businesses and industries that generate a lot of food waste. They have mandatory sorting requirements. When we look at similar legislation or similar regulation, I don't think plastic bags are in the exact same category because that's about increasing the cost and not about requiring a certain activity like waste segregation. But what we see in other waste streams is, for example, the mandatory packaging reporting. I forget if that's the exact wording, but large businesses that are involved with substantial packaging have to basically keep track of all the materials they use. And so that's become mandated. And that has also, I think, been effective, and we'll see in the future if it continues to be effective.
Okay, but contamination in blue bins remains high with about 40% of the contents being unrecyclable due to, improper disposal as well. Why do you think this continues to be such a persistent issue?
I think part of it is that contamination isn't often top of the mind. When people recycle, the most important decision, the first decision is, is this a recyclable material? And then the next step that consumers need to make is the contamination low enough, or is it contaminated? And then what do I do with it? And I think a lot of times consumers don't take that second step. They have a plastic bottle or a plastic container. Plastic is recyclable. It goes in the bin. So that's one potential issue. Another potential issue is I'm not sure there's very high awareness of what constitutes contamination. I actually did a study that was published in 2021 looking at how to reduce contamination. And I found that an effective way of reducing contamination was through visual signage showing how clean plastics need to be before you can recycle them. And they have to be nearly spotless. I don't know if you knew that, but they need to be nearly spotless. Oh. And I learned this through consultations with some of the waste collectors in Singapore.
That's very interesting. I mean, Singapore still commingles recyclables in one bin as well, but there are new ideas being tested here, Professor, like metal cages for collecting cardboard in some estates. Do you think more visible or specialized collection systems like these help change behavior?
So there are, I guess, two perspectives. One is the idea that single stream recycling is good. And that's what Singapore largely uses now, at least for domestic recycling. If you have recyclables, you just throw it in the blue bin. Everything that's recyclable goes in the blue bin.
Right.
And that's easy. All you have to know is it recyclable? You don't have to put in the extra effort to sort your recyclables. And so that creates some convenience. Of course, it does create problems. For example, cardboard boxes. Cardboard boxes, typically, when we receive them, they're fully assembled and they occupy a large volume. And if you just throw that in the blue bin, it's going to take up a lot of space. So these cages are quite effective. It does require us to separate at least the cardboard from the rest of our recyclables. But then because it's a cage, we get this visual prompt that we need to flatten the cardboard because there will ideally be other already flattened cardboard boxes in there. And then also by segregating the cardboard, it's less likely to become contaminated by contaminated recyclables. So in the case of cardboard, I think it can be effective. I don't think it will get people to recycle cardboard more, but it will reduce the contamination rate and it will hopefully make the recycling process a bit more efficient.
Now, Professor, the government has reaffirmed its 2030 goal of a 70% recycling rate. Do you think this target is still realistic?
I'm not going to use the term realistic. Is it possible? Yes. Is it likely? I don't know. I mean, the over the past decade-ish, the recycling rate has been declining from around 60% to around 50%. Can that trend be reversed substantially? And it's going to have to be a substantial reversal. So is it possible? Yes. I'm not sure it's going to happen.
Okay. Then what do you think is missing in the way we're approaching this issue today, whether it's in how we inform the public or design policies?
I guess one way we can perhaps approach this issue more effectively is to have a more holistic perspective. I'm a social scientist and I tend to focus on individuals, individual psychology and individual behavior. But over the years, I've realized how important different layers are if we talk about the linear economic model, take, make, use, dispose, right? There are a lot of different players in that process and consumers are kind of near the end. You have the retailers and the wholesalers and the distributors and the manufacturers and the resource extractors. They're all upstream, and then downstream you have the waste managers and the recyclers. And then you also have the government and you have NGOs and industry associations. And if you aren't keeping that entire ecosystem in mind, you might address a small part of the issue, but ignore other aspects that are essential to the part you focused on actually being effective.
So what exactly can be done then to close that gap and move us closer to the 2030 goal?
I think one of the issues, and I'm going to bring the focus a little bit back to individuals and I guess businesses and actually and the waste managers, is that what we pay for when it comes to like the waste management companies have to pay for incineration, consumers have to pay for waste disposal, they also have to pay for products, the manufacturers have to pay for the materials and distribution. All of these expenses only reflect kind of the direct costs involved in production, consumption, and disposal, and they don't reflect the environmental burden that we create, and that those are often described as external costs or negative externalities. And so I think at all these different levels, one of the ways to at least make us a little bit more cautious about how we consume and dispose of materials is to incorporate some of those external costs into the pricing. And a carbon tax is a good example of this. So NEA creating problems for itself. So NEA has instituted the carbon tax in Singapore. NEA also operates waste incineration plants in Singapore, and it has to pay itself a carbon tax because those emit CO2. It's kind of funny, but the carbon taxes are a great way of internalizing the environmental harms, the harms to people and planet of CO2 emissions. And then you can apply this to any kind of material, any aspect of the economy. So I think there could be more of that. Of course, what that means is increasing costs to consumers, and that's a hard sell. It would be in the form of something akin to taxes or more regulations, and those are rarely popular.
Right. Some great insights from you here. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. That was Sonny Rosenthal, who is the Associate Professor of Sustainability Communication at SMU. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.